College football nerds here to talk what the hell happened. Kansas State and Oklahoma. Does it knock Oklahoma out of the playoffs? Maybe not. We're going to get into that. But before we get into that, we want to really get into kind of just what happened in this game. It was a little weird in some spots, and we want to break it down, get a little nerdy with you on the numbers, because that's what we do. We are college football nerds. And if you like when we get nerdy, please subscribe. Please comment below. Oklahoma fans, we're sorry that we're having to discuss it in this way because we've really enjoyed hanging out with y'all this year. The rest of y'all, don't take too much joy in Oklahoma sadness. All right, Josh, this game was weird. I watched the whole thing beginning to end. It was really strange. It's kind of what you have to have happen for an elite team to lose to an underdog. Oklahoma's still an elite team, maybe without an elite defense. But is that what you saw? Are there some similarities? I know the score is different, but some similarities with Georgia losing to South Carolina in that everything was going wrong and then it snowballed. Let's just get into it. Tell us what happened, at least at a high level.
So I do think there's some similarities to Georgia, but really completely in reverse. So just setting the table, not trying to bury the lead here. The story is a defense that couldn't quite stop the opposing offense and an offense that wasn't able to have enough consistency to score at the rate they needed to score to win. So Kansas State, their offense statistics were not necessarily dominant all around. 7.6 yards per attempt, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 213 yards. That was a good day from Skylar Thompson. It was an 87.8 QBR. If you follow ESPN stats, not necessarily, a world record setting sort of game. We have 7.5 yard per attempt, usually our mark for competent offensive performance. That's about all they got out of the passing game. The problem was James Gilbert getting 8.1 yards per carry, Jordan Brown getting 5.3 yards per carry, and the consistency with which Kansas State operated. And I think one of the more interesting things when you look at ESPN stats, if you look at their box scores, they do have that QBR, which is different than a quarterback rating. We have minimal transparency to it because it's based more on what the quarterback contributes and how they throw and how efficient they are at getting the yardage they need in a given down. If you throw for 3 yards and it's first and goal from the 2, that gets you a lot of points in their metric, that kind of stuff. It's not really just about, your completion percentage or how many yards you get. Sometimes that's based more on yards after the catch. They're trying to give you a better number than quarterback rating. Jalen Hurts at 19 of 26 for 395 yards, 15.2 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 0 interceptions, has a QBR of 84.2. Skylar Thompson without a touchdown with literally exactly, less than half the yard per attempt average at 7.6, which is, again, 7.6, half of 15.2. Fun number. 87.8 QBR. That's higher than Jalen Hurts with half the yard per attempt number. And again, even a lower completion percentage. How did that happen? Well, it was due to the timing of when Thompson completed throws and how frequently Thompson threw downfield to whatever he needed to be able to get his completion. Jalen Hurts' numbers came on big chunk plays. CeeDee Lamb had a 70-yard touchdown. Nick Baskine had a 70-yard touchdown. Those kinds of numbers inflated what was otherwise, for example, take out 2 plays, and that's suddenly a 250-yard performance, which is good, but not necessarily, 250 on 24. All of a sudden now we've cut your yard per attempt number by a third. Kansas State was super efficient offensively. Oklahoma was not. Kansas State's defense was really, really good when they needed to be to get a couple stops, especially in like the red zone. Oklahoma's defense got bowed on a little bit and gave up yardage in key situations through the run and the pass that let Kansas State score. Combine that with Oklahoma having a pick 6, which messes with a game that you only had 11 possessions to start with. So a very much shortened game because of how Kansas State chose to play football. And you can see it all in a recipe. If this game, just like the South Carolina-Georgia game, if this game had stretched out to a normal number of possessions or what Oklahoma's used to, which would be like 14, 15 possessions, you could see that Oklahoma would end up winning the game. You'd have really a movement back to the mean. But in a shorter game where enough things went wrong with enough frequency, and I think in particular a game where you couldn't really stop Kansas State from scoring for a lot of the game, that all combined to give the Dell to Oklahoma.
Yeah, one of the things that we notice is a common theme, and it's not necessarily actual time, but the way that games feel like they're moving really fast. where a team the favorite starts out sluggish and it's still sluggish around halftime, and you wake up in late in the third quarter and it's a tie ball game or it's a close ball game. That's the beginning of the recipe for these upsets, but then you've got the turnovers. You're -2 in the turnover margin, which is a big deal. And then another one for me that I'd like for you to touch on a little bit. I thought the sequence where Oklahoma is a sequence in the third quarter where Oklahoma couldn't convert on a third. I think it was a 3rd and long, and then Kansas State had a couple of big third down conversions on their resulting drive, scored a touchdown. Oklahoma fumbled the kickoff. Kansas State scored another quick touchdown. That was the sequence that changed the game entirely. And like you mentioned, there were so few possessions for Oklahoma. I mean, look, they only had a total possible point total if they scored touchdown on every one of their possessions of 77 points. And they scored 41. So that's not terrible. I think the fact that pause for a second. What we talked about earlier this year on how you beat an Oklahoma team is they're going to put up a ton of points, but at some point you have to hold them to field goals instead of touchdowns. Well, they needed to do that with Kansas State and couldn't. It was like touchdown, 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 touchdown there at the end, and I think that was the big thing for Oklahoma. If they hold them to just one field goal in that stretch of like 3 or 4 touchdowns in a row, they probably win the game. What I want to talk about, though, more than any of all this, for just a minute, was how dumb the decision to punt the ball with, I think, 7 minutes or 8 minutes left to go in the game after you had driven the ball without even feigning interest in a forward pass. You've moved the ball like 30 yards. It's 4th and half a yard at midfield. Oklahoma just scored on one play, and I think they punt the ball, and it took Oklahoma like 26 seconds to get back to where the ball was. Can you please just tell me that I'm right and that was a really dumb call and they should have gone for it? And even if they don't get it, they're not in bad shape?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there. There was a point in the middle of the third quarter where I sent a tweet. And of course, we both tweet out of the Twitter account. I like to joke that all the good tweets are mine and the bad tweets are yours. I think you disagree. But I noted when Oklahoma went down 11 in that game, the play count was 47 plays, offensive plays by Kansas State to 30 offensive plays by Oklahoma. And the thing I kind of noted was when you start getting to the point where it's 3-2, 50% more plays, that was going to become a real problem for Oklahoma late in the game because Kansas State, as ended up happening, was going to get 60-plus plays where Oklahoma was still at like 40. The point where they punted on that 4th down that you're talking about, where it's 4th and manageable, and they have the opportunity on 4th and 1 to, get 1 yard against a team that's not stopping you from running and almost never dropping you for a loss, and then really just put the game away. And I forget the exact score, but I think that was when it was 18-point lead. The other interesting thing about this is I had been tracking the point at which Kansas State was going to, I think, double up Oklahoma in plays because it kept increasing. And in that 3rd and 4th quarter, Oklahoma, when they scored, were scoring very fast, and Kansas State was giving extended drives. And that's another sort of recipe for disaster because at some point, Oklahoma's defense was going to get tired, and even if they continued to score, they weren't going to be able to stop Kansas State. And importantly, that was going to let Kansas State bleed out the clock with a 3-4 score lead. The play where they didn't punt was the play where Kansas State could have doubled up Oklahoma in plays. If I remember it correctly, I think Oklahoma had 34 and Kansas State was at 67 plays. And if they had gone for it on 4th down, that would have been the 68th offensive snap from Kansas State. And I think that would have broken the back for Oklahoma completely. So not only was it a bad decision in terms of the fact that if you don't get it, I mean, Oklahoma, we kind of laughed because it took 25 seconds, literally 25 seconds of clock for Oklahoma to get back to the point where they would have punted or gone from it on, even if they hadn't gotten it. But if you do get it, then they would have broken Oklahoma's back just from a play count perspective. So there was a whole lot going on in that game and in writing in that game, both not only in terms of the avalanche they faced with Kansas State, but a lot of it was due to how really boom robust Oklahoma was, and they were getting tons of yardage or they were not, whereas Kansas State was sustaining drives. And it's that weird difference between the old style offenses and the new style offenses and the idea of ball control. Kansas State was actually playing ball control offense, still scored 48 points, and frankly, probably coulda, woulda, shoulda scored something like 55. And if they do this game could have been more like a 55-27 game. But that decision to punt in that situation led Oklahoma back in it and kept them from quite getting their back broken. Almost gave Oklahoma a chance to win at the end.
A lot of people mentioned, and I even said this in the third quarter, I was like, this is their Purdue. This is Ohio State Purdue. It's going to keep them out of the playoffs, and legitimately so. Like, I think a lot of people like to look at, like, you lost one game. It's just one game. A loss is a loss, or a win is a win. The point differential absolutely matters. To me, I think it's unfair that people, first of all, you shouldn't count out a Power 5 team right now this early with one loss. This is ridiculous. We've seen this thing time and time again. We saw it with Oklahoma last year, losing to Texas. But what everybody's going to remember are two things. One, that it's a loss to Kansas State, which is fair. But two, they're going to remember the score in the third quarter and not the score at the end of the game, and not the fact that they were a bad call, if I'm correct, and we can maybe talk about that in a minute, a bad call away from having the ball in an onside kick with a minute and 40, which is enough time for them to score 3 times to tie or win that game. Somebody even tweeted to me after the game, they were like, Oklahoma got dominated the entire game. They were leading, they outscored Kansas State 17-7 in the first quarter and 18-7 in the fourth quarter. So they absolutely dominated half the game. In terms of time, 2 quarters, they dominated. Final score was a 1-score game, 48-41. Are we unfairly already counting Oklahoma out of the playoffs because of the score in the third quarter? Or I'll allow you to disagree and say the score in the third quarter matters. They were getting blown out and they just tacked on a couple late, and actually 48-41 doesn't tell the whole story.
I think the missing variable, to sort of cut to the chase in all this, is it all depends on what everybody else is doing. And in the discussions we're having right now for the playoff, that third quarter score does matter because there are a lot of other teams that you would say would never have been in that position. And especially when you talk about the top 4. You talk LSU and Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State, by and large, are taking care of business. The one exception really was that Clemson game where they, nearly lost to UNC, but that was a close game. And even if UNC gets a 2-point conversion, I still think Clemson probably drives down the field, kicks a field goal. Honestly, none of them have been down 3 or 4 touchdowns. And when you talk about the playoff picture, the problem is and we had this discussion in the top 10. It's tough because like a Georgia that loses a bad game to South Carolina never really lost control of it. They just couldn't get control of it to win. Where Oklahoma felt like they lost control for a minute. And again, there's something to be said that Kansas State really kind of screwed up by letting Oklahoma back into it. In a lot of seasons, I think Oklahoma would be absolutely in the thick of the playoff hunt. The problem is this year, it's quite likely we're going to have 3 undefeated teams at the end of the season. I think whoever wins LSU, Alabama is probably going to be undefeated. Georgia might have something to say about it, but right now they don't look offensively good enough to really challenge either one of those teams. There's also the slight problem, and you and I have gone back and forth on this. I think part of the problem is when you compare them even to Oregon. I mean, Oregon, their only loss at this point was to a top 10 team in Auburn who beat them, with a jump ball at the end of regulation. And people are going to look at that and say none of these teams really could be controlled. And they're going to look at Oklahoma with skepticism because of how they started the Alabama game. Right, and I'm not saying even necessarily it's my opinion, but rightly or wrongly in the playoff last year, and say this is the same Oklahoma defense. And I'm going to turn it around and mention something back to you, and it's something we discussed briefly before we started this. When we did the preseason prediction, one of the things that I said, and I think you agreed with, my concern for Oklahoma was that the defense could be better and that the offense might just might take one step back and the defense take two steps forward, and they might actually lose more games as a result. And the reason for that being the defense was so bad last year, and we saw just echoes of it. And really, statistically, I already said they weren't as bad as they were last year, even now, that if they didn't sustain every drive in a game, they weren't going to win. And last year, they got a pass, frankly, from a lot of people because the offense was so good they could get away with it. They were so phenomenal. And they have been that way for most of the season, but this was one of the few games where they had glitches at time and time again. And I think with Jalen Hurts and the style of offense, the problem isn't that Jalen Hurts is a bad quarterback at all. He's a very good quarterback. It's that the strain and what the demand that's placed on a quarterback is insane if you want to win a 48-point ball game. And my prediction was that they'd drop a game or two because they'd have a game where they'd give up 48, and he just wouldn't be able to put up the 50, 60 number just because he's not the top-end NFL passer that you have to consistently convert a 3rd and 11 kind of situation, which they had a couple times. It's not fair to Jalen, who's a very good quarterback, because in any other team, you don't give up 48 to Kansas State. I mean, if you give up a normal 20-point number, you win this game handily. But the problem is the quarterback play that's required to win this kind of game at Oklahoma, I think is unsustainable with a more of a run-throw guy, because you can kind of shut down the run component, at least in crucial moments. And that itself wraps into the answer to your question. It's a long-winded explanation, but I think it's all kind of relevant. We look at Oklahoma now and we say, okay, this is the same, echoes of the same defense. It's a good offense, but it can't necessarily score 60 points every week. And when it chokes a little bit, they're going to lose. And when you compare them to playoff teams, you expect LSU or Alabama, Ohio State to put up 48 or more, but you also know those defenses are actually a lot better than Kansas State. And is Oklahoma actually going to be able to win that game, or are they going to lose by 30? And that's the ear bug in everybody's, whispering in everybody's ear. I think that's the problem for Oklahoma.
Yeah, and you talk about the pressure on Jalen Hurts. Look, Trey Sermon and Kennedy Brooks, who have been just tearing ass all through the Big 12 all year this year, 6 combined carries. 6. Jalen Hurts had 19 carries for a respectable 5.1 yards per, but 19 carries. He threw it 26 times. He ran it 19 times, and the people around him touching the ball touched it 6 times. That we can't have that in an offense that needs to score and be consistent and efficient. You're putting too much on one guy's shoulders. And to your point about Jalen Hurts not quite being Kyler Murray, not quite being able to convert that 3rd and 11. I think we saw this a little bit with Alabama versus Clemson last year, and a little bit with Alabama versus Oklahoma last year, in that when an offensive team sees that they have very little margin for error, it starts to put pressure on them mentally. And for a team like Oklahoma, if they have 2018 Oklahoma defense and they know they have very little margin for error and they have a glitch, it feeds on itself. In the back of your mind, oh crap, we didn't convert that 3rd down, we got a punt. Well, they punted 2 times, but they knew that was a problem. Well, then you combine that with, the fumbled kick, and you're in a world of hurt. So I agree with you, and that's what would scare me as a fan. If I'm a fan of a team that lives and dies by needing to score 50 points a game against elite teams and probably once or twice in a year against bad teams, that terrifies me. Okay, so all the Oklahoma fans that are watching us also watched RJ Young's recap, and this is a moment. We love this guy to pieces, and he and I are going to joke about this afterwards, but I got a huge disagreement with RJ, and I want to have you touch on it a little bit after I touch on it. He talked about how this game kicks them out of the playoffs. And if we would just get on board with his 16-team playoff where everybody gets a trophy, then Oklahoma fans wouldn't be sad today about this Kansas State loss. they'd still be in the hunt because they're going to win the Big 12 and they're going to get in it, or they can suffer 2 more losses and still get in it. And I argue that in and of itself is what should keep us totally away from any kind of playoff like that, because that means you can lose as an elite team to a team you have no business losing to, and it doesn't even sting the next day. It's not even that exciting for the rest of college football when that game's going on, because if they lose, everybody knows it's no big deal, and then we really are just looking at an eye test. If losses don't matter and we're just putting everybody in, tell me that we need, like, I know you agree with me, but we need to protect the integrity of college football, because as bad as this is for Oklahoma fans today, tomorrow it's going to be Alabama losing to an Ole Miss or an Arkansas and still getting in and getting hot late and winning the championship when they need to be punished for that loss.
Well, we already kind of sort of saw it when Alabama won the 2017 title. And both of us have made this statement a lot. The problem with 2017 wasn't that Alabama wasn't more deserving than Ohio State. The problem with 2017 was that neither Alabama that had lost to Auburn and hadn't won their division, nor Ohio State that had lost 2 games and had been blown out by an unranked team, neither of them deserved to get in. There were 3 deserving teams in the playoff in 2017, and an undeserving team won the championship. That's been my opinion for a while. If you expand the playoff to 16 teams, what you're going to end up having, people say this like in a pithy manner, but it's absolutely true. You will have plenty of teams that have no business or no right to win a championship that will win a championship. Games like this become meaningless because it's not really that hard to lose 1 or 2 games if you're an elite team. If you look right now at the top 16 teams in the AP poll, 16 is Notre Dame with 2 losses, 5-2 Notre Dame. That, you know, they lost to Georgia barely, and then they just got, you know, absolutely steamrolled by Michigan. Michigan, who's number 14. Do you think Michigan and Notre Dame have a right to play for the national championship at this point? Because I sure don't. The most we've ever had was about, you know, maybe 6. Most of the time, though, the problem is that we would sometimes have 3 or 4 teams that were deserving. Most of the time, there really weren't, and we would argue over 2 or 3 because both of them had a blemish. But, you know, I've said before, I would be okay with a 16 playoff just because there's an issue where the group of 5 pretty much can't get in with 4 because of the way conference champions end up playing out. But in my mind, the moment you get past 6, when you take 7, when you take 8, when you take 9, and to me, it's almost lunacy to take something like 16. This just isn't the NFL. You don't have that much parity. The teams outside, that top 10, and we talked about this all year in regard to our top 10, there's a big drop-off, and it's not the same group. And again, I'm going to throw it back to last year. You know, top 16, you're going to get a 3-loss West Virginia, and a 4-loss Texas, and a 3-loss Penn State, 3-loss Kentucky. Those teams don't deserve to get in. When Washington with 3 losses, including a loss to Auburn, who, by the way, wasn't
3
even
unranked losses. All were to unranked teams.
Auburn wasn't even a top 25 team at the end of the year, and we could say with some, maybe even some confidence, that Auburn might have been a better team than Washington. Straight up, Washington was 9th. I mean, I don't think people understand the drop off every year that happens in college football. Somewhere around the probably like 6th to 12th team mark, and then everything past that, you know, maybe they can beat a top 10 team on a bad day, but they really shouldn't. And so, you know, if this was the national title, or let's say this was first round of the playoffs and Kansas State beats Oklahoma, a lot of people would love it because it's chaos and it's fun. But Kansas State is not a better team than Oklahoma. They're not. And I don't want Oklahoma to be knocked out of, you know, some playoff as a 2 or 3 seed because they had to play a team that shouldn't be there, and they had a bad game where football is a weirdly variable sport and random things happen. Because everybody would say, oh, but then you have a Cinderella team like basketball. No, you really wouldn't, because Kansas State would get in the next game and they would get their brains beat in by whoever they had to play in round 2. The one-off win in football, the like random like Iowa winning, you know, or Purdue beating Ohio State, those don't turn into 7-game win streaks. those teams do turn around and lose to bad teams.
Right.
It's not like basketball. You don't get hot and go on a streak because there's not nearly as much parity, and it's not as much emotionally driven week to week in that regard that you can run a streak. College football is a very variable sport where you can lose on any given Saturday, but you don't get hot and win 8 games when you're not a good team. It just doesn't happen. And that's the problem with a 16-team playoff, because it's quite possible that you lose 1 of 4 against a fairly good set of teams. But it also means that you're really likely to lose if you're not good. And the team that, the Oklahoma that drops to Kansas State just means you have a really, really good team that doesn't get it to the end so that you can watch Kansas State get murdered the next week.
Yeah. And to me, 16, even 8, then the same argument for the 16 is the same argument for 32 or 64. Why not? How do you know? I mean, the 50th best team might beat the first team in the number 1 team in the country. We have to see them play to know. Well, there's 130 teams in college football. There's no way to know for sure, but we can make a pretty good guess. And even with basketball, with only 5 players on the court, meaning one freshman player is 20% of your team, can come in and completely turn a roster around. You don't have that in college football. Even with that, and even with the fact that they have all of these like underdogs that win throughout the regular season, I think there's been like 1 8 seed, not worse than an 8 seed, 1 8 seed win the tournament since the 80s. So, like you said, it's not going to happen. Just to put this into perspective, Penn State, who plays Idaho, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh out of conference this year, Idaho, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh, could lose to Iowa and Ohio State, have 1 ranked win, and make the playoffs. And that 1 ranked win is Michigan. They could have lost to Iowa, lose to Ohio State, and still make the playoffs. And I just think that's ridiculous. But we still love RJ, and we understand his passion and why he wants 16. I just want to protect the best regular season in all sports. Y'all, that's it for our review of this game and a little bit of a discussion on the playoffs. And let us know, if you've made it this far, what you think about Oklahoma. Should they be completely out? Should this game completely put them out? Or should we hang on and maybe see what the rest of the season holds? Thanks so much, y'all. Please like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. Y'all have a good week, and God bless.